Friends, I'm sure that after going through your study material, you might have come to know a lot about the treaties through which European Union has come into existence and has developed to this level of 27 members, having different types of complex institutions but still working very successfully. I'm also sure that you might have already watched the video program given to us by Dr. Michael Roop on the institutions of European Union. It's a matter of great pleasure and honor for us that Michael Roop has also agreed to give us another program on treaties. As already informed you in the earlier video, Michael Roop is Administrator, Committee on Foreign Affairs and Subcommittee on Human Rights of the European Union. It's a matter of great honor and satisfaction for us that he has agreed to give us these talks for our students. Friends, you have already read, or you might be reading very soon, that European Union has come to extensive existence and developed through various treaties. Of course, the story goes back to 1951 when the first treaty was signed on 18th April 1951 in Paris, which came into force on 23rd of July of 1952. And thereafter a process has been going on, and as late as only last year this Treaty of Lisbon was signed. Of course, this treaty is still not mentioned in your written course because it was printed before that. But I think Michael will be telling us more about that treaty. But like Michael, before that, I think students will like to know from you how this process of treaty making in the creation of European Union has gone and what role different types of treaties have played in step-by-step development of European Union, which has reached at this level of 27 members and also playing a very significant role in the international community and world affairs.
Absolutely. The way the treaties are handled in the European Union are very significant. Yeah. The treaties which established the European Union and which have been reformed over and over again are made by the member states. Mm-hmm. The treaty is an international treaty which all member states have to ratify within their constitutional order according to the way they do this. A treaty is prepared by what we usually call an intergovernmental conference, meaning that all member states sit together at the table and discuss what kind of changes they would like to see in a treaty, an existing treaty, and how a new treaty should look like. They discuss, they negotiate on their different positions, and at the end of this process they agree on a new treaty. And when this treaty is then agreed, then signed, then this has to go through the approval by all the 27 member states. So it is a very democratic process. Okay. It's not top-down. Everybody has to agree on the changes from the big member states until the small member states. Everybody has to be on board. You said very rightly that we started in the 1950s with this development. We moved through different stages of development of the treaties. The first big important treaty which gave a new impetus to development was the Single European Act in 1986. The Single European Act gave something completely new that wasn't in existence before. It gave the possibility for the Council of Ministers to have majority voting. For the first time, a particular member state could not simply say, no, I don't agree, and with this veto block developments, it could be, in theory, outvoted by other member states. And that brought a lot of developments forward, including what we call the single market, which is the biggest achievement of the European Union.
Michael, in India, we are many times told that this Maastricht Treaty particularly, that gave some sort of a new stage in the process of creating an ever closer union among the European Union countries. Would you like to tell our students the basic features of that treaty, because we are told it's very important, which came into 1992?
Yes. Directly after the Single European Act, 1992 is the next important step. Indeed, the Maastricht Treaty did something new because it established for the first time what we today call the European Union. It basically created an additional layer of responsibility and of political competence on top of what was the European communities. And this new layer of competence included common foreign and security policy and justice and home affairs. So things that were until that time considered to be sovereign reserve of the member states. Foreign policy, very important, normally domaine réservé as it's called, of the member states, and very sovereign questions of internal affairs, of justice and police force cooperation and so on and so forth. So indeed Maastricht made the first step to more policy fields which were beforehand considered very particular to the member states. Then thereafter, of course, the next treaty, Amsterdam, also included more and more policy fields. It made it easier, for example, to have European policies on asylum issues, on visa issues, things that are very particular to member states. And thereafter, the Treaty of Nice moved further in this direction. We have, however, always an interplay, which we should always bear in mind, between enlargement of the European Union and the different treaties. We have a very interesting dynamic. Always when the European Union was in front of enlargement, it said, this is all right, we take in these 3 or 5 or 10 new members, but in order to have the European Union continuing to function, we also make a new treaty to give more possibilities to the European institutions to work with more members. So each time we saw that new members were coming, we gave more possibilities to the European Union institutions to function well, so that individual member states could not block individual decisions anymore. This is a trend that you can see running through all the treaties.
That's right. No, but picking from this observation, I think we can move on to the Treaty on the European Constitution, which I think was very important in terms of, you can say, bringing all existing treaties together. And as you were just now saying, since the Union was expanding, and in that process giving some more a constitutional shape to this existing treaties, bringing them together and giving a new shape to European Union. So how far this this treaty on the European Constitution has been successful, and the challenges particularly this treaty faced? I think students have been concerned about that.
Yes, the Treaty on the Constitution of the European Union was unfortunately a treaty that failed, let's say. It came out of a very important development, which was that member states before the new enlargement said they have to come together to constitutionalize, in a way, the European Union, really make another quantum leap, or maybe for some just a small step, forward in order to make the European Union something a little more than just a creature based on international treaties. So what actually happened was that a convention was called together, where member states, the Commission and the Parliament had representation. They debated a text. They came up with a constitution for the European Union. This was then brought into an intergovernmental conference, as I said a little earlier, and then the member states decided to proclaim this constitution and to sign it. However, as any new international agreement, and this one was called a constitution, it had to go through the ratifications in all the 27 member states, and it failed in 2 member states.
So here this question again comes to mind again and again, particularly when our students ask us, why this process of referendum was introduced for the ratification of this constitution treaty, and when this process of referendum was introduced, was it problem of intra-state or interstate groupings pressurizing, and therefore this difficulties in ratification came in a very big way, and as you very rightly said, that finally led to the failure of the treaty?
In this case, of course, the final decision how you ratify a treaty rests with each individual member state. We had member states who said this is such an important new treaty, it's a new constitution,
Okay.
so we cannot just have parliamentary approval, we have to go through a referendum so that the people gives legitimacy. Not all member states decided to do that. Some member states said this is important, but we don't have, for example, the constitutional tradition of a referendum. We have parliamentary power, and our parliaments will make a decision on this. The two member states decided they should go for a referendum. Actually, two other member states also decided to go for a referendum. There, the referendum was successful. But in these two particular, France and the Netherlands, the referendum failed.
Yeah.
Notwithstanding the fact that many other member states had, according to their constitutional rules, ratified the treaty. But in a treaty change, you need unanimity. There is no going saying we ignore the popular vote
That's right.
in these two countries. This is democracy. They rejected this treaty. So we had to go back to the drawing board. And finally, out of this reflection period and the new process came the Treaty of Lisbon.
Why don't you make use of this opportunity to give us the basic characters of this Treaty of Lisbon?
The Treaty of Lisbon has basically taken the most of the features of the Constitution,
Okay.
has shaved off here or there some points, has changed some names, and has made it a little more palatable to especially those who were not very fond of a strong constitutionalization of the European Union. The Treaty of Lisbon has basically changed some names. For example, it changed the complex voting and procedure, the consultation procedure, the cooperation procedure, and the co-decision procedure. It just scrapped these three things and called the normal legislative procedure simply what it should be, the ordinary legislative procedure. It has done several very important things. Number one, it has given the European Union something that it did not have before, legal personality.
Okay.
The European Union never could conclude agreements as such beforehand. It was always the European Community which had legal personality. Now the European Union, this top-up that I explained from the Maastricht Treaty, became something in its own right, also international legally. The new treaty did several things as well. It strengthened the European Parliament in lawmaking, gave more, I believe 42 new policy fields were added. It's always a question how you count them. 42 new policy fields were given this ordinary legislative procedure, and therefore in these policy fields the European Parliament the same power as the Council. It strengthened the European Parliament in that the European Parliament now had the full control of the EU budget. Beforehand there were some areas where the Council was stronger and did not give the European Parliament the possibility to discuss. It introduced some new features, very democratic features, especially the Citizens' Initiative. This is basically kind of a plebiscite, not a referendum, but a possibility for citizens of all member states together to make proposals to the European Union. It's usually addressed to the European Commission to make proposals in certain policy areas. We're at the moment in the process of developing the details, how many member states need to be involved, how many signatures you need. But this is a very important new feature of the treaty.
With these added powers, strengths with the European Parliament and also with the other institutions. Now, how you think the European Union will be playing a new and additional role in the challenges which the international community is facing? For instance, climate and environment change. These are the new issues which are coming up, and the world is looking towards European Union with a great hope. So with this added powers given to Parliament and other institutions by this Lisbon Treaty, how you think the role the European Union, or what role European Union will be able to play in face these new challenges?
Indeed, you say absolutely rightly, the Lisbon Treaty gives new possibilities. It also created two new posts, very importantly, and it changed the role of one particular grouping and made it an institution. The Lisbon Treaty created a president for the European Council. It is a person elected for 2.5 years, and it made the European Council from some semi-organization to a full-blown institution of the European Union, and gave it some certain powers to guide policy developments of the European Union. It also created the post of High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy. This is the British Commissioner, Baroness Ashton, and Cathy Ashton is not only High Representative for Foreign Policy, but at the same time Vice President of the European Commission for Foreign Affairs and External Relations. And in this capacity, she will be, and already is since 1st of December 2009 when she was nominated, the outside face of the European Union. She is now representing the European Union at all important international conferences. She, together with the President of the Commission, for example, as you said, will go to the climate change negotiations over the next couple of years and present the European Union policies and proposals at these climate change conferences. And she is responsible basically for all the foreign policy questions of the European Union.
See, the European Union, particularly member countries of European Union, earlier they have a right of veto in key areas of foreign affairs, defense and taxation, etc., etc. Now, is there going to be any change in that veto power of the member countries with regard to these issues, or there is going to be some sort of, say, a decline or say infringement of their sovereignty on these very serious issues of foreign affairs, defense and taxation?
Well, especially taxation and especially defense issues are, of course, at the heart of every member state's understanding of what it is, what a state is. At the moment, we still have unanimity here, so every state can say, no, I don't agree with that, and then it's the end of the policy process in this area. It is difficult to foresee whether that will change at any point in time. We have already many policy fields where the member states can no longer have a veto and will have to agree to certain things. I believe that it is very likely that even in future reforms of the treaties, we will always have some areas, and some areas will remain, where unanimity voting exists and we will not have a majority, because they are too sensitive, and member states, when they draw up a new treaty, will not agree to give up their voting power in such a way. I believe it will always stay, but we never know what comes. In the current crisis as well, for example, for the euro, we see many new policy developments which would have been unthinkable 3-4 years ago.
No, recently what has happened in Greece, for example, that was again a very serious issue and serious challenge for the European Union to deal with. In the light of that, do you feel that some sort of new changes or say developments to deal with the situations, type of situation which came up in Greece, and the background of that, some new developments are envisaged?
Absolutely. We already see many new steps forward. We see that the European heads of state and government of the Euro Group, our group that are of the countries who run the euro, who have the euro as the common currency, have already agreed many new steps which we wouldn't have had in the treaty as such. We have already agreed on stronger budgetary surveillance. There are new proposals from the Commission, from Commissioner Olli Rehn, the Commissioner who is responsible for economic and monetary union issues. He has put on the table new proposals to strengthen financial control of member states, to move as far as looking into the accounts of member states. It is not yet adopted, but we see the policy developments, and we see major member states like France and Germany already agreeing that new initiatives need to be envisaged, and also already new treaty changes might be in the offing.
Now, since you have mentioned about this Euro group, a large number of students in India, they keep on asking that ultimately how only one currency is working. A large number, of course, all European Union countries have not become as yet a member of the Euro group, but still they keep on asking this question that what is the way in which the same currency is acceptable or say working in this a large number of countries. So this is some sort of a new understanding for the Indian students. Would you like to explain that how this euro came into existence and how this is working in a common currency working in a number of countries.
Here, the euro has been basically brought into existence by the Maastricht Treaty that was mentioned earlier. The Maastricht Treaty set in motion a several-step policy towards introducing one common currency. At the end of the 1990s, the currency rates were locked against each other and could not be changed anymore. So the exchange rate was fixed. And then over a space of 1 year, all member states who were part of the first wave of the euro basically introduced the euro in their national area and took out all the old currencies. That means that the French franc, the Deutsche Mark, the Italian lira, they all disappeared. They are now history, basically. And today, everybody very normally considers that, of course, a young French or a young German can pay with the same money that he has at home, also in other countries. This is a huge advantage. It is a huge economic advantage. It is a big advantage for the single market, that you don't have to calculate different currencies. They cannot fluctuate. That increases European competitiveness. It increases pricing. It also increases transparency. Because, of course, if you know that a packet of tomatoes costs €2 in France and 3 euros in Belgium, when you're living at the borders, you will go to France to buy your packet of tomatoes, and you have an economic gain of it as an individual consumer. You can take €1 and spend it for something nicer.
No, Indians earlier knew only dollars, but now they keep on talking in dollar as well as euro. Of course, the pound sterling will also sometimes referred, but basic currency of concern here was dollar. But now euro is talked about and discussed, and this value is discussed. So you are very right that it has given but don't you think that it has also given a new impetus in the international trade and international economy?
I'm not an international economist, but it is quite clear that from its inception, the euro has gained a lot of international trust. In the beginning, there were many economists who said, people will never believe in this artificial currency. This is nonsense. This will never work. They have all been proven wrong. Today, all major countries, all major trading partners of the European Union have their currency reserves in denominations of dollar, but also in euro. They hold some Swiss francs. They will hold some pounds. The euro has become another world reserve currency, like the dollar always was, and it's now the only alternative, together with the yen to a certain extent, but very much so the only real alternative in terms of economic power to the dollar. And that is very important, I believe, for the power distribution in the world, that it's not only one currency and the value of one currency that determines the fate of all countries on the planet. It's very important.
That's great. Michael, would you like to tell our students anything more about the treaties, the way they have strengthened the institutions or strengthened the democratic process, or what you can say some sort of major changes in European Union's working?
Absolutely. The new treaty has, for example, introduced a new voting procedure in the Council. Beforehand and until actually 2014, so there is a transition period, we had different votes in the Council, different distribution of 29 votes for the bigger member states and 4 or 5 votes for the smaller member states. And we, from 2014, will have a new voting procedure which makes it more transparent and more clear. It's called the double majority. And basically, for any decision of the Council to be taken, for any motion to be adopted, you need 2 majorities. Number 1, you need a majority of member states. 55% of member states need to be in agreement. And you need a majority of population. That means that the member states who are voting in favor of a certain motion need to have together 65% of the population behind them. So this makes a new, also democratic procedure, because of course, when you have 65% of the population behind a decision, that is an obvious legitimacy that you give to a certain policy or law of the European Union. I spoke already earlier about the new president of the European Council. Interestingly enough, also the president of the Commission and its selection should now be linked to the European Parliament elections. It is not a direct link in the sense that it says the European Commission president needs to be from the major party, but it should be taken into account.
Thank you, Michael, for telling our students the way European Union enters into treaties, how these are concluded among democratic countries, how they infringe into their sovereignty, but still every country remains sovereign, and the way the Lisbon Treaty has strengthened the institutions further and also strengthened the democratic process in European Union. I'm sure the students will keep on taking their interest in this course on European Union and world affairs, and in case they have any problems, they are always welcome to be in touch with me. Thank you, Michael, once again.
It was
for
a
being
pleasure
with us. Thank you.